Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Susan Anderson. I graduated from SU in 1984 with a degree in finance. I have had a long relationship with the College of Arts and Sciences, as my father was Philip Church, a professor of mathematics here in A&S. I am here today in my capacity as a member of the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Advisory Board, and I want to welcome you to today's A&S Alumni Academy presentation. Arts and Sciences presents these Zoom talks by faculty and alumni as a way of letting alumni know of the great research and scholarship happening in the college. We're excited to welcome you today to the first Alumni Academy of this academic year, called Sonic Signatures: The Rise and Fall of Alternative Music in the 1990s. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items to share. First, we ask everyone to mute their microphones. This will ensure that everyone can hear our presenter. We are recording this event, and it will be shared on the college's website for people to view after this evening. If you do not want your image recorded, please feel free to disable your video camera by clicking on the video camera icon in the lower left-hand corner. Closed captioning services are provided for this event. At this time, please direct your attention to the chat for additional instructions on the closed captions and a few other informational items. Right now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Theo Kataforis is an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in music history and cultures in the College of Arts and Sciences. His research is in the areas of popular music, American music, and film music, with a specific focus on the history of rock music. He has published and presented widely on various rock genres and movements. He has also explored issues of youth and gender in teen movies and emerging adulthood in recent indie rock music. His most current research is on 1990s alternative rock, so we'll be hearing a lot about what he is currently researching in just a moment. I'm very excited for today's conversation, so with that, I will turn our program over to Professor Kataforis.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And let me just get one thing ready. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be participating today as part of the CAS Alumni Academy. I want to thank them for the invitation to share my work. This is always something I'm happy to do. What I'm going to be talking about is basically derived from a book project that I'm currently involved with on alternative music in the 1990s. It's what in the field we would call a genre study, so taking a movement of music within a certain kind of time frame, in this case, basically a decade, and trying to tease out its significance, what it meant at the time, its impact, those types of things. The fact that alternative music very kind of happily and neatly falls within the 1990s means that aligning it with that period, with that decade, is a kind of convenient gesture. And actually, to kind of start things off, I want to start at the beginning of the decade. For those of you who know about alternative, probably one of the first artists and bands that comes to your mind would be Nirvana. In 1991, they released the album Smells Like Teen Spirit. This was a breakthrough moment and would go on to influence a lot of bands that emerged in their wake. So 1991 is our starting point, but I want to back up for a year to 1990. And I like to start there because one of the ways in which we can often frame artistic movements, musical movements, something like alternative, is to think of them in terms of kinds of contrast, ruptures, like what are they emerging out of and maybe defining themselves against. And in the case of a genre like alternative, I mean, it's there in the name, it's an alternative to something. I think that's a theme that we're going to see throughout the rest of what I'm presenting, that alternative, if nothing else, defined itself against something, whatever it may be. We're going to find in this case, perhaps music that immediately preceded it. So I want to start in 1990. And actually, we're going to start with two video clips, and I'm actually not going to play any sound for these. So you don't need to adjust any controls. You're not supposed to be hearing anything from these. But that's okay, because what I want to talk about, you can see just from the visual aspects of these clips. So this is 1990. These were two of the biggest songs from that year. Hold On by Wilson Phillips, I think actually was the top selling song of that year. And to the left, you have John Bon Jovi performing Dead or Alive. So this was the pop music, the popular music just prior to the emergence of Nirvana and alternative. You've got these big, wide open spaces, broad gestures. It's very triumphant looking. The music, Hold On, is a song about resilience, empowerment. Dead or Alive, John Bon Jovi is this kind of classic rebel figure. And it's very much, again, music that is almost kind of cinematic in its feel. I'm going to move on to a couple other video clips from popular music from 1990. In this case, we have Warrant with the song Cherry Pie, and Michael Bolton's How Can We Be Lovers If We Can't Be Friends. Now we're looking at other kind of pervasive themes within pop music at the time. So sexuality, desire, romance. The videos themselves, they're very clean looking. I chose a white background for this slide actually because it actually works very well with how the videos were shot. They're almost like these antiseptic type of environments that these rock performers find themselves in. So lots of guitars, lots of scantily clad women. So this was the kind of sound and image and look of popular music in 1990. So just 4 little snapshots. All right, so let's consider this then as maybe something that alternative could be an alternative to. So with those video clips in mind, I want to move to Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, which came out the following year in 1991 and was released on radio first, and then shortly thereafter to MTV with this promotional video. So this is, again, I think a pretty sharp contrast to those other slices from the popular music universe. Oh, sorry about that. That's so that's just a verse and chorus from the clip. Just from a visual sense, you can already see how this is quite a stark contrast to a lot of what was on MTV, prior to that point. It's a dark video. It's kind of dirty looking, dusky. I'm kind of going on an alliterative stream there, but it's chaotic also. And it also shows an audience. It's got a sense of humor to it. There's cheerleaders with anarchy symbols, which have been kind of like a punk symbol. So it's providing a very different visual surface, but the music itself is also much more distorted. And I know we didn't hear the other clips, but it's much more distorted, dirty sounding. And it's also, quite frankly, difficult to make out what he's singing. One of the things that actually was kind of interesting about this as a hit song, and Smells Like Teen Spirit was a hit song, was that for many people, they had no idea what Kurt Cobain was singing. And there's actually, you can go to this website of misheard lyrics. People were kind of imagining what on earth the chorus could actually be about. So this is one of many, many versions of misheard lyrics that people were conjuring in their minds at the time. So I'll play the chorus and you can follow along and see if this makes any sense. So I will tell you, those are not the lyrics, and the actual lyrics to the song were not even published until many, many months after this song and the album that it came from, Nevermind, had been released. And to me, that's actually a significant part of alternative, that it was not necessarily embracing transparency and clarity. There was a sense of kind of mystery about it, like what exactly is, the secret behind this, or what is the meaning behind this? It wasn't obvious. It wasn't already kind of pre-digested for the listeners. So it's a small point, but I think an important one in understanding why this song actually was so different than a lot of what else was on the radio or on MTV at that time. At this point, I want to turn to Kurt Cobain. And he's a good example of another sense of alternative, just in the type of kind of, star persona that he presented. Cobain was someone who seemed at times very vulnerable, fragile, and this is a very famous photo of him taken in 1990. He also, unlike most pop stars, male pop stars or rock stars at the time, kind of cloaked himself in flannel and dirty shredded jeans. He looked disheveled. In a way, it was a kind of alternative masculinity that he was presenting, to an audience. And I return now to the 1980s, the decade that this was perhaps an alternative against, and think about what was the typical rock masculine figure of that decade. It was people like Bruce Springsteen. And, the 1980s, if you take Springsteen as a kind of standard, was one in which the display of the male body was something that you expected, almost assumed that was part of the rock presentation. That's a very kind of triumphant, muscular, buff display, that Springsteen has. And, just to drive this point home, maybe even a little further than it needs to, I love always making this juxtaposition between Springsteen's pose and you've got Rocky Balboa on the right. But it's not inconsequential. It wasn't simply, masculine rock and pop stars in the 80s who were bearing their biceps and their bodies. It was also the movie industry at that time. And Stallone and Schwarzenegger, these were, two of the biggest stars of the decade. So to have someone like Kurt Cobain offer a kind of alternative, someone who's not going to display their body, who's kind of hiding it under these layers of clothing. And in fact, Cobain was very shy about his body and had, a kind of awkwardness and ashamed relationship with his body. That was a very different type of rock star, that you now have in your midst. And this was not simply male rock stars that we're talking about either. You can also relate this to how, female alternative artists, which I'll get to in a moment, were reacting against the typical images of women in the 1980s. And it's good to remember that much as the 80s for men saw the kind of buff muscularity on the Hollywood screen, likewise for women, this was the decade that saw the growth of the fitness industry. Jane Fonda was probably the celebrity most associated with this. But you had, this was a tremendous industry that was, emphasizing a new wave of female fitness. And this, again, kind of translated as well into how female pop and rock stars presented themselves in the 1980s. So again, this is a nice kind of juxtaposition between the two. Pat Benatar early in the decade, Jane Fonda towards the middle, but both of them essentially wearing and striking, wearing the same type of fashion and striking the same type of poses. This is Benatar essentially as a kind of healthy, fit, sexually desirable lead singer, and that was the prevailing image that you expected of women in rock and roll. Towards the middle of the decade, you get to figures like Madonna. And again, I chose this specifically because she's wearing her like healthy midriff shirt. So the emphasis on healthy, fit, desirable bodies, this probably doesn't come as much of a surprise when talking about women in pop and rock, because this traditionally has been how they have been marketed as, sex objects. But that is the emphasis in the 80s, against which alternative in the 90s could provide some type of contrast or debunking or debuking it. A good example of this would be PJ Harvey. So this is from 1993, one of my favorite images of her, and she has a lot of very memorable images from this period. But it's one in which she essentially presents herself almost like a kind of cadaver or corpse. This very kind of stern, grainy black and white photography, wrapped in this kind of translucent film. Ultimately, it's a very kind of desexualized and impersonal presentation of the female artist. That's one direction in which alternative rockers like Harvey could take, their art. Another would be this presentation. This is from an album by the Lunatics from 1992 entitled Binge and Purge. And so if, female artists in the 80s had been aligned with this idea of fitness and health, and in some ways, part of really the beauty industry and fitness industry at that time, then artists in the alternative era could start drawing attention more towards women's body issues. So the whole idea of binge and purge, something that at that time in the 90s, was drawing attention to as part of the beauty myth of how models would binge and purge to keep their weight down. So the early 90s for female alternative rockers, much as for male alternative rockers, part of what they were doing was providing alternative gender imagery that was trying to overturn a lot of the stereotypes that had emerged over the previous decade. All right, so that's a bit of a kind of introduction at this point in the early 90s with alternative as to how you could see it as an alternative to the kind of standards that it was working against coming out of the 1980s. All right, with that as a kind of setting, I do want to back up into the 1980s and think a bit about where this music started, because it is not as if Nirvana simply landed in 1991 and voila, you had alternative music. Rather, it came out of a fairly well-developed ecosystem. I think that's the phrase that I like to use for this, an ecosystem in the 1980s that saw the circulation of alternative and underground music in a way that the mainstream spaces were kind of separate from and very distinct from during that decade. So when I talk about an ecosystem, I'm thinking really about how this music flourished and survived at a time when the mainstream music industry was not terribly interested in it. One of the ways was through independent record labels. And a lot of the independent labels that released underground music in the US started out of punk. One of the most famous ones actually had alternative in its title. Alternative Tentacles was a label started by the Dead Kennedys, Jello Biafra, the kind of glaring figure second from your left there. These were record labels that essentially many of them were artist driven and were releasing challenging music that was not aimed at a mainstream audience. It was not concerned with sales and popularity, but rather, they were operating on a much smaller level. Another independent record label from that period, SST Records, again associated with one of the more prominent punk bands, Black Flag. That prominent figure in the front, pointing at the camera, that's lead singer Henry Rollins. I had to include this in here because Henry Rollins, I didn't have to, but I believe in promoting local events. Henry Rollins will actually be in Syracuse a week from today at the On Center as part of his spoken word tour. But back in the mid-'80s, he was fronting the hardcore punk band Black Flag. So record labels, independent record labels was one way in the 1980s that a lot of this music was circulating, in a space outside of the mainstream. Another way in which this music was circulated as part of this alternative ecosystem was college radio. And in this case, I'll have to explain this photo. This is from the radio station where I was a college DJ back in the late 80s. Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton at the time, as we called it, down the road here on I-81 from Syracuse. And the reason I chose this is not simply because I was an alum, but also they had this nice banner from 1991, where, again, celebrating 25 years of alternative radio in Binghamton, New York. So the point I want to make is that alternative as a term was circulating well before it became popularized in the 1990s. You saw it in record labels with the name Alternative Tentacles. You saw it at college radio, where there was a lot of free-form programming, and they would refer to it as alternative radio. In Syracuse at that time in the 80s, the most kindred spirit to WHRW would have been WERW, and it still is. That was a younger station than WHRW, but that was essentially the alternative radio programming at SU at that time in the late 80s. So college radio, and just another shot from the Binghamton station. This was common to most stations at that time back in the late 80s. One of the perks of being a college DJ at that time was that you got access to all these promotional copies that the independent record labels would send to college stations. That was a vitally important part of that ecosystem for alternative music, because this was how it was going to circulate it. Companies would send it to the radio stations, and the radio stations would play it. And that was getting exposure for these artists. So radio, record labels, and then the last one I'll just highlight in terms of this kind of alternative universe was print publications. And if you think of the mainstream music press at that time, Rolling Stone is probably the first name that comes to mind. They were far and away the most popular music publication in the US. But there was this other layer of monthly and sometimes bi-monthly publications, Alternative Press, Option Magazine. And again, I've highlighted ones where the actual name of the magazine, like Alternative Press, incorporates the identity of alternative into their very name. Option was a very well-known one as well, and the subheading of that was Music Alternatives. So the point I want to make here is not only that there was this ecosystem of how the music was circulating, but also that alternative music at that time was a label that people understood. It was, something that was attached to the music, whether it was through radio, the press, or the indie labels. What was the allure of this music? Part of it was that it did feel special to the people, involved as part of this ecosystem. And, one of the bands who emerged out of this, by the mid-end of the decade and eventually did sign a major record label deal was REM. And I love REM and their debut album Murmur as an example of this, of a group creating almost what people saw as a kind of mysterious, secret language. The album cover for Murmur is this kind of unusual, striking visual image that if you don't know that this is a shot taken from the South and that's kudzu growing over various objects, it almost looks kind of creepy and monstrous in a way. But the significant part is that there's no image of the band on the album. And that was common in a lot of alternative music at that time in the 80s. You know, I'll offer this as a contrast. You know, for major pop music and rock music at the time, you were selling a star, you were selling a celebrity, you were selling, you know, a persona. Whereas with REM, you're selling this sense of kind of mystery of like, what is this music like? And Murmur, much like the example of Smells Like Teen Spirit that I shared with you, was very notable at the time that it came out for having like Michael Stipe's lyrics being at times indecipherable or unclear. So a lot of alternative was not going to do the work for you. You had to put in the work yourself to kind of get at the deeper meanings in the music. All right, so that's enough, I think, of the 80s detour of what alternative kind of emerged out of in the early 90s. So Nirvana did not come from nowhere. They started on an independent label, Sub Pop Records, and then when they signed to Geffen Records in early 1991, and eventually released their major label debut, or their first major label record, Nevermind, they were following a script that was really kind of already in place for them. So another big part to consider of this is that because alternative had a substantial legacy to it by the early 90s, and a sense of ownership for many people that, you know, if you'd been involved with college radio, if you knew the independent labels, if you read those independent publications, when alternative became big, when it crossed over into the mainstream, there was this tension, this feeling that, you know, like alternative had lost some of that mystery and some of what was special to it. But what was probably galling, most galling to a lot of people at the time, is that as it became popular, you began seeing it in ways you could never have imagined before. So our old friend Henry Rollins, for example, who had been, glaring at us from, the Black Flag photo just a few years prior, by the early 90s, now he's doing advertisements for Gap. That was one thing, but in 1992, it actually got picked up. The grunge flannel look, which we'd seen with Kurt Cobain, got picked up as an entire fashion line. So Perry Ellis, they had, this is a fashion brand, created its own grunge collection by the designer Marc Jacobs that ran a year after Nirvana's Nevermind had come out, had a whole spread in Vogue magazine and a runway exhibit. So now this is taking it even further. This is truly kind of crossing over into the mainstream at this point. And then a couple years later, by 1993, alternative is big enough that it gets finally its first prestigious cover on Time magazine that wants to capture all the anger and rage and energy of groups like Pearl Jam, and as it says, who are giving voice to the passions and fears of a generation. So you don't get on the cover of Time magazine, of course, unless you've made a big cultural impact and you're probably selling a lot of records. So this is the point, maybe was the kind of breaking point for alternative, where the month after this came out, and so this came out in October 1993. The month after that, in 1993, November 1993, the cultural journal The Baffler released an issue more or less devoted to defining what on earth alternative could possibly be. And this phrase, alternative to what, became a catchphrase for a lot of people following alternative at that time. And the basis behind this, more or less, this type of kind of cynical question, alternative to what, was if you have groups like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Stone Temple Pilots and Soundgarden and Smashing Pumpkins, who are now multi-million sellers and who essentially have become the mainstream, then what are these mainstream alternative artists supposedly an alternative to? So this was kind of a crisis point within alternative for a movement that had defined itself as being against the mainstream or against kind of pop, culture stereotypes, then what does it mean to cross over into being the best-selling, rock music of its generation? So this actually, for me, is one of the more interesting, kind of aspects of thinking about alternative. And because of this crisis, a lot of artists who had started off, on the independent labels and who had, this kind of sense of credibility and authenticity, when they did cross over, I think one of the things that they developed to kind of ease themselves into now being part of the mainstream was a healthy dose of irony and sarcasm. And I think you can't talk about alternative in the 1990s without understanding the kind of deep irony that a lot of these artists offered up. And we can use Nirvana as the case point, or as the point in case. So it started early with them, really pretty much as soon as they signed to Geffen Records and were on a major label in 1991. The first tour, going out as a Geffen label artist, this is the tour shirt that they took with them. And it's a weird kind of mashup of, it's saying flower sniffing, kitty petting, baby kissing, corporate rock whores. So it's drawing on this, this imagery of kind of accommodating and making yourself part of the public. We think of politicians kissing babies. And the corporate rock whores is essentially this self-deprecating acknowledgement that they had sold out, that they had compromised their identity. So the sarcasm here, by owning this, by essentially labeling themselves, it's a way of neutralizing what might otherwise be a negative critique that could come back at them. So sarcasm in that respect was almost like a type of self-preservation, a way of kind of surviving in what were these now almost kind of ridiculous circumstances, going from selling, a few thousand records to selling millions of records. And the sarcasm throughout Nirvana's career was one of their strongest identifying, I would say, elements. Another example of this, the following year after Nirvana's Nevermind had been this huge success, they of course get invited to, for a photo shoot for the cover of Rolling Stone. And Rolling Stone was understood to be the enemy, this was not a real alternative publication. They were a mainstream rock publication. So Kurt Cobain deliberately has his cardigan open to show the most of what you can make out, which is a t-shirt in which he had written "Corporate magazines still suck." This was an inside joke. So SST Records, the label that I showed you earlier with Black Flag, their slogan was "Corporate rock still sucks." And so this was a way for Nirvana to kind of throw something to their audience and say, look, we understand, we still have not forgotten our kind of underground roots. We're having a sense of play, acknowledging, okay, we're on the cover of a major magazine, but we still have our roots, and our kind of ethos with our original crowd. The last example I want to show comes from late 1991, and this is a performance clip. We need a little more music here. This is Nirvana's performance on Top of the Pops after Smells Like Teen Spirit had been climbing up the charts. For those of you who don't know, Top of the Pops was a television show in England, and it is as it is described. Top of the Pops meant that they would take the top selling chart music of that week and they would have the band come on and play live, by which it was understood that they would be lip syncing along to the recording. So it wasn't really live, but they got to appear on stage with an audience. And this is a classic example of Nirvana recognizing the kind of artifice of this pop moment, besides how do we throw a wrench in it? And the thing to remember when you see this is that when the band would go on stage on Top of the Pops, they would have a backing track. So they would essentially be like miming along to the recording, but the vocal mic would be live. So they could actually sing and hear like the real vocals from the singer. And so this is what Nirvana chose to do, given this particular setting on Top of the Pops.
Having sold over 1 million records in 6 weeks, they're straight in at number 9. Here's Nirvana with Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Load up on drugs, kill your friends, it's fun to lose to them. She's overjoyed, self-assured, and all I know to do. With the lights out, it's as dangerous. We are now entertainers. I'm just stupid and contagious. We are now entertainers. Colorado, Albino, Tito, Bonavito, yeah.
It's an amazing clip, and I love, of course, that the cameramen know enough to pan up and show that Cobain's not actually playing the guitar, Chris Novoselic's not actually playing the bass line. So it's kind of embracing the kind of playful artifice of the moment, and I can only describe like Cobain's voice there as maybe like reimagining Jim Morrison doing a goth version of Smells Like Teen Spirit. But the point is that this was a way of kind of a survival mechanism of being able to kind of keep some sense of the credibility that you had built up as irreverent artists, as part of that underground ecosystem. I totally, absolutely wish that this is what we remembered most of alternative. But at this point, I have to turn to this, which is, of course, the sad fact that Cobain, as most of you, I would assume, know, took his life in April of 1994. And I mention this because events like this can very much shape the perception of a movement. And when this happened in 1994, the effect of that was to, in a way, kind of change the tenor around alternative. I think after 1994, people were less likely, or it was less likely to be written about in the media as a kind of like irreverent freeform type of movement. And it became associated much more with kind of bleakness and depression and anger and mental health issues. And one of the things that came in the wake of this that became in a way kind of tied to alternative was the publication of this memoir, Prozac Nation, Young and Depressed in America, by Elizabeth Wurtzel. And this was a huge bestseller, New York Times bestseller. This was popular enough at that time in the 90s that by the end of the decade, it had even been made into a movie starring Christina Ricci. And the significance is that Elizabeth Wurtzel, actually was a music critic and talks about Nirvana in the epilogue to the book and addresses the connection between the depression associated with Nirvana and Cobain and her own depression. But this became, in a way, the kind of setting in which a lot of people understood alternative, that it was music that had tortured artists, that it was a kind of haven for people who wanted to kind of express their sense of anguish and pain and suffering. And so this became a way for the press to understand and depict artists at that time. Just a good example of this, one of many. It became very common when interviewing artists to broach topics like mood swings. So this is an interview with Eddie Vedder, January 1995, and the interviewer, Alan Leicht, asks him point blank, would you consider yourself to be somebody who has always had serious mood swings? So you don't ask questions like that as a journalist if you don't have this kind of background of understanding that they're part of a music scene and part of a kind of musical expression, expressive force, in which you understand the artist to be somehow volatile or unpredictable, or to be suffering from something that is tormenting him and leading him to create a certain kind of music. And we're used to hearing about mood swings now. It's just part of our kind of regular language, the way we can talk about things. This actually, prior to the 90s, you really did not read about mood swings connected with music terribly that often. This is something that became attached to alternative at the time and has since become something very common to think of in artists and their music. One of the reasons I also like this image of the mood swing is that it is a way of thinking about the sound of the music itself. And I want to play a track. So this is now 1995, the same year, the grunge song by the Vestibules. If you were in Canada in the 1990s, perhaps you saw this when it played on Much Music, but I don't think that this had much travel or circulation within the United States. But alternative by 1995 was well enough known that you could do a parody of the song style pretty easily. And the grunge song takes as its sonic parody this whole idea of a mood swing between a quiet verse section and a loud, explosive chorus. This is, of course, what you heard in Smells Like Teen Spirit, and in a way it became the sonic signature that people most associated with alternative. So I'll play a little bit of this because it's a parody and it does kind of capture, I think, the relevance of the time.
This is the part of the song that's really quiet. We play very soft. It sounds like a ballad. And this is the part where we play real hard. It's much louder than at the beginning. And we go back to the quiet part again. If the whole song was this way, it would be boring. So we go back to playing loud. It's like the first time, but slightly louder.
So I'm at the concluding point here, and I promised in the title for this presentation that we talk about the rise and fall of alternative. We're at the fall now. And it's one of the exercises that we go through as historians when we're kind of mapping out genres and movements is precisely that. What is their arc? What do they encompass? When does something die? When does it become less relevant? One of the ways is, well, it can be through actual artists dying, like Cobain in 1994. This happened to rock and roll back in the 50s, when you had the death of Buddy Holly, or you had Chuck Berry ending up in jail. But that's one way. Another way in which a style or a movement can die, so to speak, is that it becomes formulaic. So by the time that you can get a pretty on-point parody, that means it's familiar enough, well-known enough, and formulaic enough that maybe it's getting a bit tired or boring. So by 1995, sure, people know exactly how alternative music sounds. It sounds kind of like the grunge song by the Vestibules. But really, often how a movement dies is that it simply stopped selling as much as it once did. Or, to use the quote from Andy Shun at MTV that's on the slide, it's not as hot as it once was. And so by 1996, MTV is beginning to play different music. They don't feel that people are as angry. I love this quote, they're re-electing the same president, so maybe they're more upbeat and they don't want to be depressed again with alternative. And then you really know when a movement is over when they start looking for something else. And so by 1997, Rolling Stone is already fishing around and seeing, do we have the next alternative? And they're proposing maybe it's electronic music, by which we mean electronic dance music, artists like the Chemical Brothers or the Prodigy or Fatboy Slim. So we can say that that's when it ends. And just to wrap it up, here is your timeline from everything I talked about over the course of the 90s. By birth, I mean the explosive release of Nevermind, the conflict, the parody, and then ultimately the exhaustion. This is more or less the rise and fall of alternative, and hopefully I've been able to capture a few of the salient points along the way. We're at the end of the talk, and so I think this is the point where I'm more than happy to do Q&A and provide whatever answers I can to the questions you might have. And again, thanks to the Alumni Academy for having me. And thank you for taking time out of your day to listen.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kataforis. That was really interesting. I'd like to open the event for questions right now, and please either raise your hand or you can type a question in the chat and I'll read it if anyone has any questions. Anyone? Does anyone have a question they would like to ask? Okay, I'm going to ask, I have a question that I'm going to ask. Do you feel like the music industry today creates the same opportunities for alternative music as was the case in the 90s? Or has it shifted in the types of artists and genres that it creates space for?
Oh boy. I mean, there's lots of ways to answer this. But first, let me acknowledge that alternative didn't go away. In fact, Billboard eventually created an alternative chart, which they still publish in their Music Trade Weekly. And so there's still alternative artists out there, or artists who are marketed or labeled as alternative. But, I mentioned ecosystem. The ecosystem is completely different now. In a way, alternative in the 90s was the kind of last gasp of the analog age, or I want to say when people were still buying a lot of physical copies of LPs and CDs, and now of course it's a streaming economy. So because of that, I think the way an alternative artist would get noticed or kind of come into our awareness would be through much different channels, and it would probably sound like different music. So grunge, there's still traces of it in certain artists. Olivia Rodrigo, actually, who's a big pop star now, she draws quite liberally from alternative music. I think a lot of younger artists are really intrigued by this music from before they were born. And so it's out there both as an influence and as a kind of label that still gets put on artists who sound very different from the stuff I just played. So that's a kind of winding answer, I think, to what you asked, but it never went away. Let me put it that way.
Okay. Jackie has a question. Go ahead, Jackie.
Hi, first of all, great talk. It was really a lot of nostalgia here. My first question is Nirvana or Pearl Jam? And that's the burning question, I think, on the chat. And also, just in general, what are your thoughts of any new breakthroughs that might be coming through on the music scene, especially since it is so broken up with all the different choices of consumption out there? Thank you.
Oh boy, this is a hard one, and I will say that as a professor, when I teach a course, I'm supposed to be value neutral. so you never play your hand to your students. But for you all, I will go ahead and say Nirvana over Pearl Jam. I could elaborate on that many ways, but I think Kurt Cobain was an incredible songwriter. And I just on that level, I think the song, like his approach to songwriting is something that resonates with me more. You know, in an earlier generation, it would have been the Beatles versus Stones question. And in that one, I would have said Beatles. So maybe this is like an echo of that. I don't know. As for tips for new music and what's breaking through, I'm a bit ashamed to admit that I've spent so much time working on alternative over the past year that I stopped listening to a lot of new music, and I was discovering all these little corners of bands that I had missed out on from the 90s. So I'm not as up to date on things as I once was. So I don't have like a hot tip for the new stuff, but I will say my 13-year-old daughter really likes Olivia Rodrigo. So I already mentioned her once. This is twice now. So that's my tip to you. And that's not like a new breaking artist, like she's pretty big already. But I'll give it a double shout out to her.
Okay, we have a question from Jeff in the chat, and he asks, is punk today more influential than alternative?
Is punk more influential than alternative? I mean, boy, this is, I feel like this could be a multi-chapter answer. Punk's history by this point is so diverse. I mean, it's wound through so many different phases, from, you know, the early like British stuff, through hardcore, through thrash, through emo, through pop punk. And the fact that it has so many kind of like tributaries at this point, in a way, it is kind of more influential, I think, because at the moment we're in a bit of a kind of emo pop punk revival. Well, I'm about to give my third Olivia Rodrigo shout out. Good for you. You know, I mentioned that she draws from grunge. She also draws from punk. You know, that's a pop punk song. So yeah, I mean, I could see punk as like having a bit more influence now than alternative. It's also much more easily recognizable. You know, if you say punk, people can very like easily conjure up like what a punk sound is. Whereas alternative, if it's not grunge, which for many people is the first thing they think of, it can mean a whole array of many different kind of styles.
Okay, and we have a question from Shakwana. She raised her hand. Go ahead, Shakwana.
Hi, thank you. My question is, considering the rise and fall based off of I took it from a lecture point of view from my students who were not used to introspective reasoning. I think that's the way to put it, having been a political science major at Syracuse. So for my students in the background, my question as the professor is, based off of your presentation, including the visuals and the audio, and just considering ability awareness and that maybe everyone didn't receive it the same way, do you have any suggestions for like these young college professionals who are still taking courses on how to navigate the legalities of a rise and fall of a music genre that haven't necessarily seen documented in the 21st century, per se, that a lot of people get their information online? So if they're not Rolling Stone fans, if they don't know the difference between Pearl Jam and Nirvana, they could be listening to Arctic Monkeys and quite frankly not know. And so do you have suggestions about, for those young people that might actually be right on here?
So if I'm understanding correctly, if this isn't your music, you didn't like kind of live through it as I did, and you are experiencing it secondhand, and kind of piecing it together from, you know, stuff, who knows the credibility of the sources and any of that. How do you know that what you're listening to falls within this genre that I've outlined? Is that more or less the question of how to help, like, say, a young...
That's absolutely the question. And I'll just let you know that the reason I asked that question that way is one reason. You made a major point about how it was the whole genre Rise and Fall was about defining what it was.
Yeah.
Today, with cancel culture, you can lose your life savings talking about alternative and not knowing what it is. So I am talking for the people who may not necessarily be numbskulls. They talk too quickly. And I grew up with them, but I don't relate. So considering your expertise in this moment, that's what my question is. Thank you.
So, I mean, part of it is that, in a way, this is why we do the scholarship that we do, to kind of create these documents, to create histories that people can consult. And I'll say, like, the first book that I wrote, which was on new wave music of the late 70s and early 80s, one of my proudest points about that is that it's been referenced continuously throughout Wikipedia, which is where people now go to find information. So I hope that ultimately when this book comes out, it like winds its way into the kind of public understanding of what this movement meant. But I absolutely understand what you're saying. I'll use an example that's not alternative. I was just grading a paper in which a student was writing about Lynyrd Skynyrd's Sweet Home Alabama. And this was the only piece of this band that they knew. And they just assumed that this was country music. Now, for me, like, I'm a rock historian. I'm like, oh, that's Southern rock. They're a rock band, but they are hearing it and comparing it to what they know now without knowing any history of the artist. And that's their frame of reference. So Lynyrd Skynyrd, and I completely can understand why they would make that conclusion. So the labeling of music can be highly subjective based on our experiential realm. I guess my answer is that there's no foolproof way to ensure that, a young fan is going to know that history behind it. Nirvana t-shirts is another good example. You can walk across a high school, college campus and see tons of people wearing Nirvana shirts. For a lot of them, it just may be a cool logo. They might not know next to anything about the band. I know people who will buy band shirts without even having heard the artist, just because they like the logo. I think it's a result of a kind of free-floating culture that we have right now, where things are so accessible that there's less concern about, are you like a dedicated fan of this, than rather have you kind of picked and chosen things which kind of speak to you in terms of their image. So anyway, I don't have like a great solution to it, other than, as educators, the best that we can do is to provide the narratives for them and hope that it sticks. But I feel it very much.
So I think we have time for one more question, maybe. We have a couple more questions in the chat, but I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to choose Jeffrey Stone's question, which is, what if Kurt Cobain hadn't died? What do you think may have happened to alternative music?
Oh, I am not a good prognosticator. I mean, the realist in me thinks that, that their later albums wouldn't have been as good as the early ones, because this tends to be like the trajectory that we see for a lot of artists. Maybe he would have gone in different stylistic directions. I will go out and say that I don't think it would have affected the rise and fall that much, because by 1994, there was already, I think, a sense of alternative beginning to wane or ossify a bit. So I don't think that much of anything that Cobain would have done would have changed that. But again, we don't know. No idea.
Okay, this is going to be a hot take one. This is from Carolyn. I'm just going to do a part of your question, Carolyn. If you're familiar with Boy Genius, what's your take on them?
I know the name Boy Genius, but I don't know enough to offer a good opinion. So that's my cold take. Okay.
Well, in the interest of honoring our 1 hour commitment to this broadcast, I'm going to say thank you, Professor Kataforis. It was really interesting. I'm glad we got the chance to learn from you today, and we, had a lot of questions. As I mentioned today, As I mentioned, today's event was the first in this academic year's series, and we will be hosting more of these events throughout the year. You'll be getting an invite to our next Alumni Academy being held on Thursday, October 12th. It's called Monsters in the Movie Lab, the Longevity of Hollywood's Classic Monsters. That event will feature Professor Will Scheibel of the English department and his research on film history as seen through the lens of classic movie monsters. With that, thank you again, Professor Katasporis, and thank everyone for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Quick